George M. Johnson's in the building, y'all. I am just so excited to talk to you. I can't even wait. The people know who you are. I must say, you are someone that I've wanted to talk to for a long time. I was first introduced to your work through All Boys Aren't Blue, which New York Times bestselling author. Hello, come on, somebody. This book has literally, I know you hear this a lot, but it has changed the way I view my own journey. It's changed the way I think about our experiences as Black queer people. And I can honestly say it's changed my life. So, first of all, thank you for saying yes to this. Thank you for being part of this platform. My intention for this series is to create conversations that are healing for Black boys, Black men, Black non binary people. And I think you are such an example of that. So, first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for being here. So, I want to ask you how you're doing, but I want to ask you from the perspective of your younger self. If your
Mm.
younger self were to look at your now self, how would they say you're doing?
My younger self would probably be uh, upset that I don't get enough rest. I think, in terms of who I've become and the work that I get to do, um, I think my younger self would be like, why are you not prioritizing yourself sometimes?
Mm,
I think everything else is pretty great. I think my younger self would be very proud of like the work that I'm doing, how I'm staying steadfast and what I'm passionate about. But I think that my younger self would be like, you are not doing a great job of your own self care right now, and you have got to get back on track, Miss Thing.
mm. That's interesting that you would say that because looking at you now, right, the successful version that you've become, I think a lot of us who are successful, and we all get to define that in our own way, but we are constantly on the go, right?
Yeah.
We're constantly moving, constantly going. And rest is not part of the success package, right? It's not how we're sold success that you also get to rest. So I'm curious, why you think that's a struggle for you? Is it society? Is it personal? Is it just you're an overachieving workaholic? Like what is it?
Oh boy. I think that the struggle is primarily internal. I actually don't think it's external. I put more on myself than is required at times. I wouldn't, I don't call myself a perfectionist because I'm definitely not a perfectionist. Because I actually like revisions and I like edits. I like to get those things back. But I do think that at times I don't sit in success and I haven't sat in my success very well. And so a thing will happen that's a great achievement, and my mind is already thinking about the next thing or already working on the next project. I oftentimes forget to post successful things, and I'm thankful that I have friends who are always reminding me, like, hey, you just got this award, you didn't post anything about it. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't know. And they're like, you don't know about what? Like, what is that thing that holds you back sometimes from celebrating yourself? Um, and I don't know. I think it could be generational. I think, when I think about my grandmother and I think about like the strong women in my life, I think a lot of times they forgot to celebrate themselves at times. My mom isn't huge on it. Like sometimes she, like, even when we just gave her birthday, like her sisters, my aunts had to like convince her that it was okay for me to throw her this elaborate party. Like
Yeah.
it just was a lot for her to take in. And I think that I'm that same way. My friends know I'm an introvert. And so sometimes that introvertedness makes me dive into work and kind of in like a head down space to tune out everything, when sometimes I should be smelling the flowers and just going on walks and taking hikes and just doing things that also can bring me joy. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, I think it is self inflicted. But I will say this morning, I actually started in a much better way. I've already been to the gym. I've already
Wow.
showered. I've already eaten breakfast. Like things that I sometimes just not forget, but just delay because of whatever internal thing I'm feeling. I've already taken my vitamins. I've already taken my meds. Like I really did wake up this morning with a very, very different focus about how I had to start prioritizing myself a little bit better. So
I think that so many people can resonate to what you're saying, and particularly for Black people who, I grew up in a family where self care wasn't the priority. It was taking care of everyone else. And I think that that caretaker spirit that you talk about, that you witnessed in your grandmother, that you even witnessed in your mom, it being difficult to receive our flowers. I think there is certainly some generational cultural ties there that make it more difficult. But I also want to say that you really talk a lot about your family and your work. I mean,
yeah,
you paint such a beautiful, story that is complex and nuanced and beautiful, and it's layered, right? It's not monolithic in any way. And part of that is what you also talk about, is that pain that's there, that comes from some of that trauma and some of that, the pain that we've experienced. And so I wonder, when you think about your own story of growing up in your family, witnessing what you've witnessed, being around all these powerful Black women, who was George? Who was George, or who was Matthew, I guess is the right question.
yeah.
But who was George in that, and how did you evolve into understanding what manhood represents for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. For me, when I think about like who I was, this kid, because I did go by Matthew and I still go by Matthew to my entire family. And so I think about like that young person I was, it really was such a confusing time, um, because I just didn't know where I fit. And it was like I just felt like an anomaly. I knew I was different. By the age of 5, I knew I was different. I just didn't have the language, to say what that different was. But I also think about the fact that like the things that I enjoyed doing were not acceptable by society standards. So I enjoyed doing hair. I enjoyed jump roping with the girls. I enjoyed effeminate things like gymnastics and just things that like as a boy you weren't supposed to like. And so there was always like this constant pressure of like suppressing what I really loved, in effort to have to do things that society said were the things that were meant for me. So I played basketball and I ran track and field and um like I did, hung out with my cousins and like I did things that I grew to love, but that weren't natural things that I loved to want to do or be a part of. Um, I think as I, kind of went through life, young adulthood into adulthood, I started to see versions of myself. And I think that kind of opened me up to understanding that one, I already existed and that there were many people who existed who had those same type of feelings that I had. And two, that my journey to get here today was an evolutionary, like an evolution, right? And so when I think
Yes.
about how I used to like to do hair and how I used to, watch my mom and then put on makeup and things or wear heels and things, and I would think to myself like, well, one day will I be able to ever break free of whatever that thing is that holds me back from being my full self? And I think anybody who has watched me, especially over the last 10 years, has watched this journey of where I have grown in my politics, I've grown in my way of thinking. Identifying as non binary to me is not just about gender identity, it's about how I view the world. So it's much larger than just my micro being daily, it's also how I macro view the world. But I think like that freeing of Matthew and that freeing of that little boy comes every time I put on an outfit that goes against what society says I should wear. Every time I get my face done, every time I do a photo shoot, every time I do certain things that most people would say are anti manhood. Um, I continue to free the little boy and continue to free others who are watching the journey of my evolution because at some point, whatever the thing is that they're stopping themselves from doing, if they see me do the thing enough, at some point they then too do the thing. And so, in essence, which I've heard this many times before, is when you heal yourself, and then you talk about your healing publicly, you oftentimes will heal a lot of others. And so
Mm,
the journey of healing is twofold for me, and it's always been twofold for me. And my journey of manhood is twofold for me, um, because there's nothing that really defines it. Like we have to define it for ourselves. And so my definition of it really can't be put into words. It just can be put into my existence. So how I exist is my definition of manhood, and that doesn't have to be put into words for me. It's how you receive it. And unfortunately,
mm.
people receive my manhood as a threat to theirs, when realistically they should see it as something that can open them up fuller into who they actually are versus what society has always put them in a box that they needed to be.
Yes. Yes. Ashe and amen to that. I mean, we can end the recording right now. There's so much there that you said. I want to read something from We Are Not Broken. This is on page 46 and 47. But you say, I'll read page 47. As young Black boys, we are groomed to fight and use violence as a tool of power and as an entry point to masculinity. There isn't a doubt in my mind that the violence we saw and experienced contributed to the violence we may have enacted. And I'll just read a little bit on page 46 where you say Black Americans historically, we are subjected to extreme violence, including whippings, among other abuses at the hands of the then dominant white community. We were indoctrinated in violence, conditioned through and by violence, and colonized to adopt it as our own. And I'm curious in what you're saying there and in what you just said about this definition of masculinity, including violence as a means of expressing that masculinity. What are the mental health ramifications for that type of indoctrination on young Black boys?
Yeah, I mean, the mental health ramifications are serious, like they're severe, right? And from two different perspectives, right? Because what ends up happening is for young Black boys, when we say that they can't cry and that they can't emote, and that emoting is a form of being effeminate, what happens is the only other way that they can process any of their issues, anything that they're dealing with, any of their traumas, is through rage. Because if you can't emote and you can't cry about something, the only other side to get something out is to be be enraged with it. And then that rage shows up in the world as being hardened. It shows up in the world as um, like I said, because violence in many ways is cyclical. So it's like a circle. So someone harms you, you at that stage may not have the power to harm that person back, but you then take that same harm and place it upon another so that you can feel dominant within your manhood, because the person who is chipping away at it is somebody that you
Mhm.
can't fight against. And so you try to regain the pieces that are chipped away by enacting that violence on someone else. And I think mental health wise, it's like, young Black boys, and I know like there's been like language around like what does it mean to be like a soft Black man, and not soft in the sense of like not fighting, but just soft in the sense of like caring for one another and showing and expressing care in a new way.
Yeah.
I think it is important when we talk about young Black boys that we allow them the space to say how they're feeling, to talk about what they're feeling, to talk about what their struggles are in society, right? Oftentimes, like you already see it, like from a very young age, they are being conditioned to be womanizers, to be misogynists, to be homophobic. All of these things are happening. Um, but what also is happening is that they also exist in the world with young girls and with LGBTQ people. And so they're constantly being put at a crossroads of this dominant power that is telling you, I have to hate these people, versus the fact that they actually exist in community with us and are trying to
Mm,
find out what the balance is of, why do I have to hate this person who just seems to be so cool to me? Like, why do I have to assert my dominance over this person who I really think is a great person? And it's these other things, these other entities that are in their mindset that are telling them this. And so I think that's, then, as we watch young Black boys matriculate into Black men, we hear these interesting perspectives from them, from primarily like basement podcasts and stuff. But um, where they're just like spewing like this hatred towards
yeah.
other groups of us within community, but they never can pinpoint where it started, right? Because they don't
Mm,
have the we don't give them the I'm not even gonna say we don't give them the grace. I think we give them a lot of grace to go there. They just refuse to go there. But if they could go to the place where it's like, what pinpointed your hatred of a gay person? What pinpointed your feelings of like this towards black women? Right? It didn't start when you were 20. It started when something that happened when you were 7, or something that you were
mm,
told when you were 9. And you were just told it and you just lived by it, not realizing that you still are living by something that you were told that was incorrect when you were 9. And so I think about when I think about their mental health, a lot of what has to happen is an unlearning, and like an unlearning of all of the things that they've been indoctrinated with that have been taught to them incorrectly. And that also starts with them being able to open themselves up to being led by somebody who also is not a heterosexual black man, to be led by queer people or trans people or non-binary people or black cis women. Like they have to get to a place where they realize nothing is a threat to them or their existence or their manhood to be led by somebody who you have been indoctrinated to think is less than you.
mm, mm. That's so powerful. And, I wept actually when I wept a couple times when I read reading your book, both of your books, when you talk about "And We Are Not Broken," your relationship to sports and to double dutch, and that you felt you had to choose between the two. You felt that you had to prove your masculinity to the boys around you or to certain people in the family, and then also betraying your love for the things that were associated with femininity and sports like double dutch and that sense of internal self-betrayal, right? And then moving to And We Are Not Broken, you talk about that conditioning. You talk about it on page 168 when you say boys are conditioned to attain their manhood through sex, and you say we should condition black boys to respect those of the opposite gender without seeing rejection as a denial of their manhood and identity. Furthermore, straight black boys and men should be conditioned to respect all identities with the understanding that their blackness is no different from the queer and trans person's blackness. And again, thinking about that internal battle that you're having with doing things that may be more masculine and doing the things that you love that are also maybe seen or viewed as more feminine, and then this outside conditioning that's telling you how to be, telling you what manhood is, telling you or not telling you, right, about who you should be. How did you find your voice? What was the crux that really helped you to find your voice and see and critique, right, that like everything that I was taught maybe isn't true or isn't Bible?
Yeah, I think what really helped me to find my voice was, recognizing that in being, taught all of those things, I still was being oppressed by those same people, right? And so it was like I'm being
Wow.
taught these things. I'm being taught to try and assimilate into um, a black manhood. Being taught that even if I am gay or queer, I should still have to present a certain way, and I should have to dress a certain way, and talk a certain way, and walk a certain way, so that I can do my best to fit into all spaces. When realistically, my attempts at doing that never brought me any closer. One, it only took me further away from being who I truly was, but two, it never brought me to any real acceptance from that community. It only brought me into a place where they tolerated me.
Mm,
And what is a life of having to exist in all these spaces or desiring to exist in spaces only for you to just be tolerated? And
wow.
at the cost of like your own identity, just so you could be tolerated. Like I think I started to then realize, like, one, I just don't want to be in those spaces if that's what it takes, and that's fine. But two, that my existence as who I was just mattered more. It mattered
Mm,
more than um, trying to fit in with people who simply would never see it for me. And I think that's one of those things that we all have to do internally sometimes. Is like we fight so hard to fit in when many of us were just made to stand out. And so in that fight to fit in, we're really like denying what our purpose was here on the universe. If I
mm,
continued down the path that I was going originally, um, trying to fit into respectability politics, trying to fit into these molds and these societal standards, I would have, there would be no All Boys Aren't Blue. There would be no writing. There would be no teachings. I would have continued to do work in the field of finance. I would probably be working at a bank somewhere, maybe as a VP, wearing suits and ties and every day and just existing. And that could be cool and everything, but when I chose to be who I was able to not only heal myself and find myself, but then I started to realize that through my healing and through my work, I was put here to do this work. And so that's regardless of what a societal standard or barrier that was put in place. And so I think that's realistically for me what became my turning point was, you know, that constant desire or want to fit in somewhere that would never accept me, no matter how much I changed myself. Like I could have started speaking differently, I could have started dressing properly, I could have started doing all those things. And the final stage would have been, okay, but now could you just stop being queer? Right? Like
Mm,
you could do all these
right.
things, but there are certain things that you either, and if I make that decision to say, okay, I'm not going to be queer anymore, like oh, then who am I? Am I who I am, or am I just a person that I'm pretending to be? I think that's was like one of the hardest truths that I had to come to was like I'm not being myself. I am pretending to be this person.
Mm,
And
mm.
at some point, you just have to stop pretending. And sometimes it's like you have to stop pretending with yourself. And I finally just got to a point where I stopped pretending with myself and started to lean into who I actually was. And I think that is why a lot of the things I manifest and a lot of the things that I work on and do um, have benefited me in so many ways because I truly do lean into the side of right. And the side of right for me has always been who am I innately, not who has this society tried to make me to be.
Yes, and you've also been so transparent in your books about talking about your journey as one that is ever evolving, right? That it
Yes.
wasn't just like one day you woke up and were proud to be this non-binary amazing man that you are, amazing person that you are, right? That there was nuance there, that there was denial, that there was the asking questions over and over, are you gay, are you gay? And I used to get that question all the time. When I read that, I was like, oh my god, the horrible, right? You just like, oh my god, is anyone, do I have it on my forehead? Like people are going to stop asking me this. But you are very vulnerable in the books and talking about your journey as being one that was progressive. And I think that gives hope, particularly for people who are identifying as Black and non binary, Black and queer, Black and gay, because the journey is not easy, right? And it's not this false, you're not selling us this false narrative that you're just supposed to wake up one day and feel confident about who you are. But you do tell us that it's a process, it's an ongoing, everyday learning process, learning to accept yourself, learning to resist those dominant narratives, learning to affirm who you are. And in, All Boys Aren't Blue on page 51, you say, let yourself unlearn everything you thought you knew about yourself and listen to what you need to know about those who navigate life outside of the margins of a heterosexual box. And you also talk about agency and the importance of agency and finding that agency within yourself to change your destiny. I want to talk briefly about your you've been very transparent and open about your sexual abuse, sexual assault that happened in your life. And I will also self disclose that I'm also a survivor of sexual assault. And, I think that it's such a complicated thing to talk about, especially when it happens with people that you know, which often it does, right? We know that the statistics are that when children who experience sexual assault experience it, right, it's not happening by a stranger who's coming out of a bush. It's often by someone who the family trusts, the family knows, the family loves. And in book one, All Boys Aren't Blue, you address it with such empathy and compassion, and also you demonstrate that sort of should I not, I want to share this, I know it's healing, and in the name of healing I share it, but I also deeply love this person. It's very complicated. And in book two, you sort of acknowledge that your first sharing of your experience was one that was very difficult for you, and that you weren't able to sort of own the fullness of the experience in a way that you were in book two. So I want to bring it up because I think for people who will listen to this and watch this who've experienced sexual assault or abuse, whether that was in your family or by someone near the family, a close friend, it's often a complicated relationship. And people often feel guilted when they hear conversations like this. They think, well, why am I not where George is? Why am I not where Laz is? How come I can't forgive this person? Why am I still holding on to these feelings of hatred? And so what can you say to individuals who are struggling to accept themselves, who might blame their identity on what happened to them, who might be feeling a sense of responsibility to sort of fix it or make amends, or who are just carrying around this hatred? What would you say based on your lived experience?
Yeah, energy, I guess energy is important to me. Like, and I think we have to learn, or what I had to learn over time was, how do you repurpose energies that you have that may not be doing you any justice or any service? And
Mm,
so for me, hate in many ways has become an energy that I've learned is a disservice to me and a disservice to my mental health, a disservice to my being. It doesn't mean that there aren't certain people who I loathe, but it doesn't mean
yes.
that I also have to put energy into that loathing of them.
Mm,
And so when I think about just those particular traumas of the past, when it came to sexual abuse, sexual assault, um, I often think about one, how, forgiveness is a very personal thing. It can be a very challenging thing, but also how forgiveness isn't always a necessary thing. And so I think we think that healing can only come through forgiveness when realistically the person we need to forgive is ourselves for even doubting ourselves. The person we need to really be forgiving is, um, yeah, let me go into that a little deeper. We need to forgive ourselves, right? Because I think sometimes we think forgiveness has to be something that, well, I forgive you and then it has to be accepted. I now live in a space where it's like forgiveness and closure doesn't always involve a second person. Like I can
wow.
forgive myself and also close the door on the person who harmed me at the same time. And I can have
Hmm.
forgiveness and closure without that other person ever needing to be involved. And so I think from that standpoint, I think, the guilt and the shame that comes from it is because we are conditioned once again, and I would say like mainly conditioned through television, I think does a disservice in this way. When we look at shows that discuss rape and sexual assault, sexual abuse, there is always like a, well, why didn't you scream? Well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Right? Like, why didn't you fight? Or why didn't you call the police? Or why didn't the police show up to kick in the door to save you? Right? Like, and because TV has depicted sexual assault and sexual abuse in a way that looks different than what it actually is when you go through it. And
Hmm.
so I think realizing that the images and the ways in which we perceived what sexual assault and sexual abuse look like aren't the actual ways in which it occurs. It isn't the actual ways in which a person's body processes it and
Yes.
mind processes it in the midst of it occurring. In the midst of it occurring, there are often times, and I felt it in this case with me, like there was a shutting down that was happening,
Mm,
and that shutting down is pretty much, it's like your body basically like, or your mind basically like tries to almost just protect you in a way, and it just like freezes you so that,
yes.
it's not a fight or a flight situation. It's not a yell situation or a scream situation. It's just a survive situation. And so that is how I then try to teach other people. It's like the fact that you're still here is the resilience. The fact that, you continue to wake up every day with that particular trauma on you is the resilience. And so it really then becomes, how do you repurpose that hatred and that energy into something else? And for me, it became storytelling. For someone else, it could become painting or art or whatever, hiking, or like you can realistically repurpose any type of energy, negative trauma into something else for yourself that benefits you every day. But the
Yes.
carrying around of the guilt, the carrying around of the anger, it's a stressor, and it's not healthy on the mind or the body. And it's just one of those things where, that learning how to love on yourself, heal through yourself, and actually process it yourself, I think is more powerful than the notion that we always have to have a second person present for our forgiveness. And I think that's been a beautiful journey for me. Even when I've had like the loss of friendships, the loss of just relationships, or like you said, when I've been harmed by someone, I don't always need an apology anymore. I don't need anything. Like, I can apologize to myself, I can process it with myself, and I can close the door and get closure with myself. And I think that was a really, really drastic change in my life, post that. And again, like, when it happens with someone that you love, it is complicated because it's like this act of harm happened. It doesn't erase all of the love moments that you had with that person, all of the fun moments you had with that person, all of the joy you may have had with that person. The acts of harm don't just automatically erase those. And so I think it is okay, though, it's okay to process that you still had joy with this person, and that this person possibly at a time made you happy. Like, there's
Yes.
nothing wrong, but we're taught to feel guilty about that because it's like, well, they harmed you. It's like, yes, but they also made me happy at moments too. And your body, your mind doesn't just erase all of that because a harm occurred. And so I think that's why I said my view has become non binary, because it's not just black or white.
Mm,
It's not, it doesn't have to just be right or wrong. It doesn't have to be forgive or forget. There is always a third option, and it is that you could do both sometimes,
yeah,
or you could do neither. You could repurpose the energy. There are so many other options available for you for your healing with any of those type of situations. So I think anybody who is listening to this, especially if they're dealing with sexual abuse or sexual assault, to realize that a lot of that work, it can be done with yourself, and a lot of it can be like a repurposing of the energy. Um, because realistically, what happens is you lose trust. And so
mm,
that's the thing. When a person violates your trust, you then stop trusting everybody else. And so,
yes.
but the first person you end up stop trusting is yourself. But we
Woo,
don't ever realize that, like, because you stop trusting yourself realistically, because you're like, well, how did I allow this to happen? I can't even trust that I can. But we don't always process that. We just, a lot of time we process it. Oh, I'll never trust another man again. I'll never trust another woman again. I'll never trust another this again or that again. But realistically, the person we actually probably lost trust with us was with ourselves, and we didn't know that. And so we're projecting it a lot of times on everyone else, when realistically we got to rebuild the trust with ourselves again, to know that the situation that may have occurred to you had nothing to do with anything that you did. It had
that's right.
everything to do with the other person. And so to rebuild that trust again with yourself is where that forgiveness to yourself will come. And then, like I said, closure can be a thing that doesn't involve the other individual.
That is a huge, huge lesson and learning that I'm taking away from this conversation is that it doesn't need the other person. I was actually talking to someone recently about this, and I said, what really frustrates me is that I didn't get the closure that I wanted with this person. And what I had to come to a terms with was that the person that I wanted the closure from was not in a space where they could offer me that closure, right? They weren't in that space. Even though I brought it up to them, they gaslighted me, they told me it didn't happen, they denied it. They weren't in a place to be able to offer that to me. And I went for years thinking that I was never going to be able to receive the closure because that person never admitted it. And I had to come to that lesson within my own life, which was that energy that I was carrying, I was holding the person energetically hostage to my experience. And my liberation came when I was able to say, they do not have the skills or the capacity to acknowledge and own what they've done. But what I can do with my experience is to shift it from a space of victimization, right, and blame and holding them energetically hostage to allow myself to be a more liberated self, to allow myself to give myself the compassion that I needed from them, give that to myself, and to relearn that I can trust myself. I can be around other people, that I can protect myself, right? That sense of trust. Huge, huge, huge lesson. I want to go talk about therapy for a little bit. You write in All Boys Aren't Blue on page 28 that therapy is still very much a taboo subject in the Black community. Those who are seen as having issues with their mental health face a lot of stigma and discrimination because mental health is often conflated with mental illness. And so as we're talking about, these experiences that we've had, where does therapy come into the picture in your life? Is therapy for everyone? Do all people need it? What's your stance on therapy?
I had a mentor who once told me every Black queer person need therapy. He was like, I don't care, even if you think you okay. He was like, and at first I was like, that's a lot to say. But then now that I think about it, I'm like, I agree. I think every Black person needs therapy, every single one. And people may
Mm,
be like, well, why would you? Every single Black, we are the only people on this earth who have to go through what we go through. And there is
yes.
no amount of money that can keep you away from anti-blackness and racism, no amount of money that can stop a system of oppression from oppressing you, no amount of money that stops homophobia, racism, sexism, misogyny. There's no amount of success or anything that stops you from still having to deal with that stops you from when your heart jumps anytime a cop pulls you over, that stops you. But
Mm,
that is something that is very, very um specific to Black people. And so with that, I say every Black person definitely needs therapy, because to process the fact that we have to live in a world like this, and to process the fact that we have to go through these very, very specific things that only we have to go through, is a lot. Especially because a lot of times people don't know that they're actually a part of these things that we're going through. A lot of people don't even know they're being oppressed. A lot of people don't like, I'm good, I'm not oppressed, until something happens or interaction happens, and then they realize like, oh, but why are you treating me like all of these other Black folk? It's like, because to them, you will never be any different than any other Black folk. They don't care about your identity or this or this or that. Like, at the end of the day, we all have to be in this together. And so I do look at, therapy as something that, one, all Black people need because of what we have to deal with. Um, but two, I also look at like other ways of healing that help us too, like whether it's spirituality, whether it is like mutual aid and how community comes together for one another, how we show up for one another. I think all of those other aspects are important, like hoodoo and spiritual practices that, many of us don't know or don't fully understand, even though we may be doing things that have been passed down by our ancestors who did fully practice it and understand it. And so I think there's healing and therapy in that too. Um, knowing about who you came from, where you came from, right? Because I think that that's also part of this too, is that our genealogy is really messed up. And the destruction of our genealogy sometimes means that many of us are still looking for like, where do we belong? And
mhm,
again, that's another thing that I think sits on a lot of our minds that we just never talk about, that feeling of belonging. But I think more and more people are like, well, my family lineage is from Virginia, my family lineage is from here. And people are like, well, no, but in Africa, and they're like, no, no, no. It's okay that your lineage started here too. Like, we can
mhm,
acknowledge two things that can be true. Yes, I have a lineage that is tied to people who are still in Africa through slavery, but I also have a lineage that started here, and that is okay. But I think therapy is like, that's therapy to me, right? That's like that connecting
mm,
of dots sometimes, where it's like that longing for home when you didn't realize that you have a home, right? And so I think that's like, but I think like that's why all Black people need therapy, because I think there's this longing at times for something that they don't know already exists within them or for them. And I think
mm.
therapy helps you to get there in a society that tries to um, block you from getting there.
Yes, yes. Well, you do talk about your relationship to spirituality in your book, "We Are Not Broken," which I have to say the titles of both of your books are just incredible. "All Boys Aren't Blue," "We Are Not Broken." I'll get to that in a second,
Thank you.
but you're welcome. You do talk about your relationship with a particular pastor of a church saying that they can't accept you as you are. And as someone who grew up in the Black church, Black Pentecostal church, I was also told something very similar about my existence. And so I think it's really encouraging to hear you say that while there are certain traditions and practices that may offer us liberation, that there are also some of those traditions that have created harm. And this
Yeah.
idea of multiple truths, right? Like both things can be true at the same time. And yet, back to this idea of agency, that you can create your own pathway, that you can find your own path of spirituality that leads to your liberation. But I want to go talk about the titles of your books before we wrap up. But All Boys Aren't Blue and We Are Not Broken. I think that what's so powerful about this is that you have a way of bringing us all in with these titles. You have a way of making it all encompassing, yet you still are very specific in who you're speaking about. You're specific in the nuance that's there. You're specific in about how the different layers and manifestations of blackness, of queerness, non-binariness, now how that unfolds
Yeah.
throughout different people's lives. And there's such a that's such a skill to be able to do that. And I just want to ask you, what's the thread? What's the thread through your books, through your writing, through your activism? What is that message of hope that you want for all Black boys to know?
Yeah, I would say that the message of hope is, honestly, like, we are more than what society has defined us as. And I don't think that's said enough. Like, I think we let the definitions of society rule and dictate how we have to move and how we have to act. And I look at people like, Dwayne Wade, who is showcasing the world that what you all want to define me as is a person who should be rejecting my child. And we don't have to sit in what the definition of what you think is right is at times for how I should be navigating a situation with having a transgender daughter, right? But I think about like examples like that. Like most people would have been on the side of rejecting his child, right?
Right.
And that is what the indoctrination of him should have been and should have looked like and should have like if you look at how just black boys traditionally are indoctrinated and all those things, that is the other side of that should have looked like the rejection of his child, and it didn't happen. And
Mm,
so I think the more times that we start to define what love looks like for our community, for ourselves, not what other people have defined what love should look like for our community, I think we get um, like much closer to, I don't know, I think that gives us that light. I think that gives us that hope that, oh my God, what has always been doesn't always have to be. Because what has always
yes.
been was rejection of this particular type of dynamic. And to watch my family publicly supporting me and them publicly supporting their trans child and so many others where we're now watching more, it's like, oh wow, like what always was doesn't always have to be. And I think that gives you hope for what it can be.
Mm,
When I think about Generation Z and the fact that they enjoy using pronouns, the fact that they enjoy identifying who they are very early on, all of those things are showing us that my generation that didn't get to define it, this next one has moved us into the next stage. And if you keep looking at that those little glimpses like that are what can give you that hope. And but I oftentimes talk about this too, like that hopelessness is also not necessarily a bad thing because a lot of our liberating and a lot of our movements and a lot of what our ancestors did to get us to this place didn't necessarily come out of hope but came out of hopelessness. Like it
mm,
came out of like hitting that place where you don't think that you have any other options, and then you hear like old black folks say they made a way out of no way. If you know that you could get to no way and still make a way, that's hopelessness. That's not necessarily hope. Sometimes hope can be a deterrent um to progress, because a lot of times we'll say like, well, I hope it gets better, but it's like, does hope make you actively do something to make it better, or does hope sometimes make you want someone else to fix it for you? um
mhm,
and that's just something we have to ask ourselves. But there have been times where I felt hopeless, and then that has given me the courage, the strength, the thing to make a decision to change my circumstances. And so I think both can exist. And so I say it especially to, especially I think it is a through line in my books too, is like hope and hopelessness at times, because I think it's important that we can hope for a better future, but also don't let hopelessness be a deterrent to changing our future as well.
Mm. Wow, George, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My heart is so full. And I know this conversation is going to reach so many people, so many parents. Uh, this community is built to promote social justice and
Yeah.
equity for all of us. And your work does that. Your work is about us, for us, by us. And I'm just so grateful to be in community with you. And I'm so grateful for all the nuggets you've shared today. Everyone, please follow George M. Johnson everywhere, social media, purchase the books. All Boys Aren't Blue. Can you see it? And We Are Not Broken. George, thank you. Thank you for
Thank
sharing
you.
your light with us.
Thank you.